I cannot emphasize enough how badly ISO is explained in photography. ISO changes your camera's sensitivity to light. Use ISO 100 in daylight and ISO 1600 at night. Believe it or not, that is one of the biggest reasons why you're having issues understanding photography and why many of your images look pretty crappy compared to the shots you see in magazines. In the last two videos you learned how aperture and shutter speed can control the amount of real light that your sensor is exposed to. Once the shutter of the camera closed, the light is blocked and the sensor is not exposed anymore. Now the sensor passes the information it collected, being the amount of light particles, to the processor of your camera. If the light was enough to get a good image brightness, it will basically store the information as is onto your memory card. If the image is not bright enough, the camera has the option to artificially brighten it and do as if it counted more light particles than were actually there. In every other area, people would call that gain or amplification, which would be super easy to understand. In photography, we call that ISO. The reason behind this is that in the past, when people were using film, an ISO 100 film was in fact chemically different from an ISO 400 or ISO 1600 film, so it totally made sense back then. But the overwhelming majority of photographers is using digital cameras. These work completely different and make the old explanation totally wrong. The industry failed to make a clear cut when it comes to teaching photography and keeps on explaining ISO as it has been doing for the past 100 years or so. Maybe we can stop the confusion now and see ISO as what it is: the gain. What does that mean? Let me quickly elaborate on what we've learned so far in regard to shutter speed, or exposure time as I prefer to call it. I divided the camera sensor into separate smaller units and each one of those units collected light particles. These smaller units represent the pixels in your image, so if you zoom into an extreme on your image, you can see individual pixels. Let's concentrate on 4 of these individual pixels. One of them collected 4 light particles, the neighboring pixel collected 10, another one 2, and this one 3. That's the raw data that the sensor passes on to the processor of your camera. As I said, if that creates the desired image brightness, the processor will leave it as is and convert it to an image that would roughly look like this. But back to the raw data. What if that is not enough light to achieve the desired image brightness? Then the processor has the option to add some gain. ISO 100 is usually the base setting of your camera where no gain is added. Now what if you set it to ISO 200 instead? There is no magic happening at all. The processor just pretends the sensor has counted twice as many light particles and just doubles the numbers. So 4 becomes 8, 10 becomes 20, 2 becomes 4, and 3 becomes 6. And after that amplification, it saves the artificially brightened image to the memory card. If you set it to ISO 400 instead, the processor would just quadruple the number instead of doubling it. At ISO 800 it would multiply the number by 8, and so on. So ISO only pretends there was more light. In reality, the light wasn't there. And that creates problems. Before we get to these, here is a quick tip to help you deal with the ISO numbers. Before I tell you that, let me just digress for a few seconds. I'm sure you understand that it took thousands of hours to create this course. If you watched this far, you probably appreciate it, and I want you to understand that the way I do YouTube, it doesn't make me rich, nor does it pay enough to continue creating courses like this. If you want to give something back to help me create more courses, there are 2 ways. First, you can purchase the Wolf Method tools that go alongside this course, and second, you can use YouTube Super Thanks. Click on the heart below the video to raise my motivation level even higher than it already is. Thank you so much. Back to learning photography, here's my tip on how to better memorize the ISO numbers. Hardly anybody realizes that for most cameras the ISO number in fact contains very useful information. I told you that usually ISO 100 is the base level and ISO 200 just doubles the amount of light particles. If I were a camera manufacturer, I'd just replace the 2 zeros with an X. So ISO 100 would become 1 by, ISO 200 would become 2 by, and so on. It's dead easy. Why make it so complicated? Many people will tell you a higher ISO will make your sensor more sensitive to light. No, that's not the case, and that's not even possible. The sensor collects light particles, just like 2 balls in the rain are collecting water. You cannot collect more water by making the balls more sensitive to water. If you want more water, you need to extend the time you expose them to the rain. So ISO is applied after the image is already taken, and therefore ISO has nothing to do with exposure. If you raise ISO, the sensor is still exposed to the same amount of light it has before, so the sensor is still collecting the same amount of light particles. The misinformation that is out there is leading to a major problem. People thinking that ISO makes the sensor more sensitive to light will make them raise ISO way too lightheartedly. Hey, I just raised my ISO to 3200 because I just love the fact that I can make my sensor more sensitive to light. That's what people are basically taught. Instead, you should see ISO for what it is, the gain. And the gain comes with the downside that I already mentioned in lesson 1 of this free photography course: noise. You don't want noise in your images, so when you don't really need a higher gain, don't use it. See ISO as the ambulance. You'd only call the ambulance in case of an emergency. It is a much better choice to employ aperture and/or exposure time and let real light into a camera, because only real light can make your sensor count more light particles. If you now wonder how you can give aperture or exposure time priority over ISO, I promise the next video will enlighten you. Before we get to that, I want to tell you a secret. In the last few years, noise removal software has become better and better. Whenever you really need to set a high gain, there are tools that help you fight noise in post-production. To show you the results of 2 of them, here is the original, our basketball shot with ultra high ISO. Here is the result you'd get with a denoise function in Lightroom called Enhance. And here is the result from Topaz Denoise AI, a very popular noise removal software. So there are ways to improve images with noise, but you'd still get better results by avoiding it altogether by choosing the best possible camera settings. And now for some fun learning stuff. In the last video I told you that I will provide a playlist for the Lou. All of you who are enrolled to the Wolf Method can find the link when you're logged in at wolfarmory.com. You can watch these very short memory aids each time you spend a few minutes in the bathroom, if you know what I mean. If you haven't yet enrolled, the Wolf Method will speed up your learning big time for very little money. For example, with the drill trainings that are created for most lessons. Still not sure? There's a 7-day money-back guarantee, so why not trust your gut and give it a shot? Your future self will thank you with better photos.